our event. I'm Alex Lubin, the director of the Center for American Studies and Research, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Elena Glasberg is a faculty member in the Expository Writing Program at New York University, and she has held appointments at Princeton University, Duke University, and Cal State University, Los Angeles, and Knox College. She completed her PhD in English and American Studies from Indiana University, and Dr. Glasberg recently completed her first monograph on ice, Antarctica as Symbol and Material, which should be forthcoming next year. And this was a project that was aided by a 2004-2005 NSF-funded research trip to US bases in Antarctica. Dr. Glasberg is published in the Journal of Historical Geography, Women's Studies Quarterly, and has also co-edited a special issue of The Scholar and Feminist titled Gender on Ice. I'm also very pleased to report that next year Dr. Glasberg will be a visiting faculty member in AUB's Center for American Studies and Research, where she will teach Introduction to American Studies as well as courses in cultural geography and mapping. Dr. Glasberg's lecture this evening is titled American Studies on Ice, Recycling Limits and Hard Limits in Antarctica. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. I can't thank everyone enough and for coming. I hope you don't, if you feel like it, come a little closer because there's going to be things to look at and you might miss. This is probably going to be the most Antarctic of the images. You might miss the details. And I need you to look at this because I'm assuming that no one's been to Antarctica here. No one's taken those courses on Antarctica here, read those books. Has anyone? What do you think of? What do you think of?
Does North Dakota qualify?
Oh, at times. In fact, I think it's colder in North Dakota a lot of the times than it is in Antarctica in the summer, anyway. Do you have any associations with Antarctica?
Yeah, there's a really interesting movie, Werner Herzog's Encounters at the End of the World.
Ah, yes. Good. So you've seen that. So you see that even. Yeah. Yeah. And that I'll be talking about some of the locations that he filmed at, the American base there. So you know that there are bases there, scientific bases. Any other just associations? It's not about knowledge. When I say Antarctica, what do you think? What do you think of? Penguins. What do you think of?
Eskimos.
Okay. Problems, yes. don't and do not tell me polar bears, okay? Anything else? Any other ideas?
The environment.
Yes, thank you. And so I'll be definitely getting with that. So, no other associations? I know
Technology.
Technology? You are cheating. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. Anyone else thinking of sublime icescapes or exploration? I think these ideas are probably on the tip of your mind. And if you can look at this image for a minute, if you could just tell me what you actually see.
Tracks.
Footprints, tracks.
Big machines and small machines.
Yeah, vehicles.
Okay, so the tracks are different?
Mm-hmm.
One bigger than the other?
X marks the spot.
You see X marks the spot, nice. Anything else that you might see?
Something at the end of the picture?
Yeah, so you have the idea of a perspective, and maybe those tracks are leading to something, but you don't quite know what. Perhaps you might associate with Antarctica the idea of a vast emptiness, a tabula rasa, territory without end. The idea of the last place on Earth. It was indeed the last place that humans technically arrived at in those layers of exploration. You might sometimes associate the idea of the sublime, right? Because it is beyond the edge of the known world, and trying to capture it visually is leads you into a whole history of trying to imagine very large spaces, sort of like the oceanic idea, except this time it's frozen. You might also associate Antarctica with the idea of wasteland, which is sort of the other side of the sublime, that is often associated with something that's so beautiful it hurts. But the wasteland is so frustrating because you go and you want to see this place, you want, if you're an explorer, if you are anybody who lived on this earth, you want more territory, you want some value from this place, you want to get something for it. And Antarctica does not give that, or has not given that. And it's been a problem. So Antarctica is a problem for seeing, it's a problem for the human body. You may have, I think you didn't even, it's so in your mind to say, but you don't have to say it. There are no people that come from Antarctica. It's the only place on the planet that has no native population associated with it. So that everything that human culture has to be transported to Antarctica. So it has resisted in a lot of ways. The ways that we see, we be, and we make meaning and make money. We make value. So what I'm showing you here, and you're seeing a lot of its aspects, is an image of Herbert Ponting from 1913. And he's a British guy who's associated with, come on, has anyone here ever heard of Robert Falcon Scott? Dead heroes, people who walk to the pole and don't make it back. Yes?
Didn't Scott fail to reach Antarctica and then he did North Pole, right? Or not?
No, he couldn't because he stayed in Antarctica, kind of longer than he ever would. He's still there, as a matter of fact. Yes. So, but you do have an idea of the British turn of the century heroics, the European really. There was a race to the South Pole. The British lost to the lowly Norwegians. Yeah. And there's been a cultural battle ever since over white masculinity. And I'm not going to belabor that whole history, but it's sort of the prehistory. I'm trying to set it up here for you. This image, however, is probably, well, I think it's the best photograph ever taken in Antarctica. And it's sort of a one-off, an accident. It isn't the kind of image that you normally associated with heroic photography. It's actually a found object. It's almost accidental. You can imagine the photographer just turning around and taking it. You could also imagine him setting it up, but I don't think he did. It was this. You notice there was a difference in the tracks, and it turns out this is a penguin track. I don't show you penguins, only their tracks. They're vanishing. And overlaid over it is the mechanical, the human, the ski. And so we have sort of the crossings of the human and the animal on the ice, which is evacuated of both of them, only the trails. And so this is sort of also an image of a history that, well, it's crossed out, as you say. X marks the spot, but it's also a history that crosses itself out. It's a seeing that crosses itself out. One of the many ways I like to think of this image is of do not come here. Stay away, go away. And those are some of the ways that I have been thinking about Antarctica over the years. And as you know, well, I am an Americanist, and I do have that background and those perspectives, and yet I take it to this place that, in a lot of ways, said to me, don't come here. There's not an American history here. Those heroes, none of them were Americans from the turn of the century. Though it turns out there was a prehistory of American interest in Antarctica, and after the Second World War, the U.S. has become the preeminent power there. But talking about America's relation to Antarctica has not been obvious. And so I like, when something says no, I go. And that's the kind of Americanist I am. I look at a lot of British photographs, and in fact a lot of the stuff I'm going to show you today wasn't necessarily done by Americans. in some sort of obvious way, but it's all about American empire. And I would say that the concepts that I'm going to put together for you are about fine art, and this is a fine art, a photograph taken by someone who thought of himself as a camera artist, but also a commodity, so it circulates and it actually creates value from the valueless. It's also part of a quasi-military science expedition that was privately funded, and also a government expedition of the British. So it's also about those junctures. And those are going to be the parameters of what I'm going to talk about today. Oh yeah, I got to show you this in a minute. But first, I'll just that was me when I was not in Antarctica. Okay, this is a facsimile of Antarctica in New Zealand. So I was on my, I think I'd come back, and you probably can't see it too well, but that's my name tag, which this is government issued stuff. It wasn't mine. They make mannequins in New Zealand, and so I took mine off me and I put it on that person. And so this is a layering of the idea of approaches to Antarctica, the endless deferral of trying to get to this object. And I guess I'm hiding behind a version of myself. But here, I'll get back to the Scott idea. This is, this is a fallen hero, literally. Scott has a bunch of statues to him all over the colonial world. So there's one in London, this thing, and he's wearing his gear and he's looking like this. There's one in London, this one's in New Zealand, there's another one in Hobart, and really if they had their way, they would have put it in all their colonies everywhere. New Zealand, Christchurch, last year, the big tumbler, the environment took its revenge and literally knocked this guy off his pedestal, which is actually what's been happening culturally for many years now. The British were the big heroes. They lost the race to the pole, but they won because they were, the British. And over the years, people have been chipping away at that reputation. We call it the post-colonial condition, and I'm going to mess with it a little bit. The other thing that this image represents is one of the big problems to approaching Antarctica and thinking about it, I like to think, cogently, and I call it the beautiful man problem. And that is the idea of the sublime, the idea of heroic masculinity that has been divorced from the terrible history of colonialism, so that Antarctic exploration becomes the only place, the saving grace and the place to recuperate this history that is littered with continues to produce all the things that we study at this point, including the beautiful. So these are the problems that I'm going to try to navigate around. And you may be aware that there's a lot of imitations of these heroes. The people continue to go to Antarctica for a variety of reasons, but almost everybody there has Scott, not you guys, but people have Scott on their mind, and they go there to basically follow in the footsteps, and that's a style of expedition. It's a form of tourism, it's sort of adventure tourism, and it gets replayed over and over again. These guys have become the most popular and sustaining ways to make connections to Antarctica. You're probably also familiar with the coffee table books, right? The magnificent vistas, you can imagine it, icebergs, no people, right? And all that kind of thing. And I have to counter those traditions as well. And I'm going to counter it by doing a little bit of explaining some of the geopolitics of the region. And this is a map. I do a lot of maps. It's a very typical map. In fact, I just snatched it from the internet today. It's a sector map, and it shows the claims of mostly European, but other people got to claim, other nations claimed as well. And it represents the Antarctic treaty system, which is another thing you may or may not know about Antarctica. It is not only the only place without native population, but it is a continent that is run by an international treaty that was signed. It's post-World War II, 1959, 62. It came into to being brokered by the U.S. So the international treaty defers the various claims that had been made by nations over the years, really starting back retroformed to the 14th century even. So it adjudicates those claims by deferring them into the future. Now, 2042, supposedly, the claims will be unfrozen. And it also does that by representing them in ways like this through the sector map. And it looks like it's makes Antarctica look like a beautiful cake with icing on it, right? And they often use these colors, blue and white. And so there's slices of the map. And the problem is, besides the obvious that not every nation gets to make a claim because you need a lot of money to make claims, you need history. It's very hard to enter into the treaty system because you have to do science there, and science is the ticket in. The other problem is that, as I like to say, if you notice the center here, the South Pole, it says the Amundsen-Scott base, U.S. So the U.S. Has actually claimed, at least nominally, and maps count for a lot, is what I'm trying to say, the center of the map, so that these claims, let's say a nation, had some activity here, and they want to claim this sector. So you see how the sector is formed. You can have a claim anywhere on the territory, but the sector is formed in this kind of mathematical cone that comes from the center of the map, and it goes northward. The problem is that because the U.S. occupies the center of the map, it actually has a foot in every one of those latitudes, and in some ways obviates all the sector claims. Or at least I'm very interested in the idea that the U.S. has a form of empire in Antarctica. Other nations do too, but I'm particularly interested in trying to talk about how the U.S. Is maintaining an empire there, an empire that no one really knows how to talk about, especially the people who are actually running it, which is the government, the National Science Foundation, and the private corporations that supply them with workers and other support, their support, of which they need a lot. So for the U.S., this map and the reality of Antarctica includes this little-known history of capital investment since the 1920s. They created first military, and then after 1959, scientific bases, and that they're connected is very important to me. And I like to quote this guy. He's one of the people who works for this Antarctic support services, but he's a former Navy Vice Admiral named Lautenbacher, and he likes to say that people need to learn more about what's going on in Antarctica. So he's very interested, like I, that people should learn more about Antarctica, but I think we probably have different ideas about what precisely people should know about this place that's 98% covered in ice. And that one of the things that I argue in my book about this place is that that in its geophysical remoteness, as well as its geopolitical exception as the only continent not possessed through sovereignty, Antarctica indexes the exceptional center of U.S. nation for which its many extraterritorial occupations are foundational repressions. So I hope to make that statement clearer as I go on. I would say that my work takes part in the reorientation of American Studies field imaginary. Let me try to explain that a little bit. In 2009, Tom Wolfe, the novelist, wrote a New York Times op-ed piece in which he discussed what he called the curious case of Antarctica, where U.S. interests never took the form of an official claim, and that's true. This is all, the U.S. never has legally claimed the area. It's just de facto. And rather, he thought it seemed to extend the Monroe Doctrine of influence without territorial claim. And that's what interests me in what's going on with the U.S. empire in Antarctica. Wolfe was reacting to W. Bush-era neo-imperial policies around the Gulf Wars. And it seems obvious that Antarctica poses an interesting case for thinking about the continuing forms of U.S. empire. Yet his insight goes against the grain of major Antarctic environmental historian Stephen Pines. He's the guy who wrote this book in '87 called The Ice. And he's a well-known historian. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He has a much more conventional periodizing of Antarctic exploration. He calls it within the third great age of exploration on Earth, and he understands Antarctica as characterized by terrestrial limit and disappointment. To Pine, Antarctica remains, and I would argue it must remain, a wasteland. But what Wolfe can clearly see, that Antarctica is a site for U.S. global power, is precisely the view that Pine and really most conventional historians shut down. I say even further, by enacting a version of American exceptionalism, where America doesn't really have an empire because it can't, because it's European, it does things differently. But I suggest that Pine is enacting American exceptionalism through Antarctica. He is also aligning the de facto coloniality of the U.S. presence on the continent today under the Antarctic Treaty System, which, as I hope I made clear, defers all claims and operates Antarctica as and you may have heard this, a continent for peace. Are you vaguely aware that Antarctica is only for science? That's what they say, just science. So I have to spend a lot of time addressing that, what that actually means in day-to-day and geopolitically. And I do that not by really looking at maps, but by looking at art. And I'm going to get to this art very soon, because I've talked about the sector claims. So yes, that's where we're at. I became very interested, though I have to tell you, I started out being a literary scholar about this whole topic. Antarctica as a literary fantasy in American literature was what got me going. Edgar Allan Poe, anybody? The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym ends up all the way at the pole of the South Pole, and had crazy racial fantasies and everything. People like that sort of thing. And I decided after a while, I don't want to do a paper trail. I got much more interested in what Antarctica really was, the ice itself, and the literary fantasies and their endless sort of reiteration of each other and citing of each other wasn't enough. So I had to I had to get geopolitical, but I also decided I had to get to the ice itself somehow. And I did. I eventually went as a human body there, but that wasn't getting to the ice itself either. By the materiality of ice, I mean something else entirely. And I hope to be able to show that to you quickly. So now I want to talk a little bit about scientific management in Antarctica. And that was a hole in the hole. I skipped that. This is a picture I took that shows the layers of ice that look like, as a geologist and a glaciologist that showed me this spot that I photographed, he said the ice opens like a book on leaves like a book on its spine, which I thought was inspiring, but I've left it behind for a different kind of ice, scientific management ice. So when I write on ice, that I think about Antarctica as a site for that engages the limits of what I call biopolitical management of ideas that are about survival and futurity in a time of climate crisis. So now we have arrived at the environment that you noticed is so key to the way that you think about Antarctica now. And so the idea of climate crisis is how Antarctica has finally become important, maybe really for the first time ever. And this happened to me as I was writing about Antarctica. No one cared about the climate when I first was doing my dissertation. So now I've had to roll along with my object, which continues to grow. And as you can see, it still sometimes shocks me how Antarctica has become central in a lot of ways. So I'm very interested in how governments manage their populations through this place where almost nobody is, and yet becomes very, very important. So here, I just wanted to show you, this is an ad that showed up in the DC Metro 2 years ago. It's for it's for Lockheed Martin. And they're involved in Antarctic support and they're military contractors. And they have the Antarctic wing of their businesses because it makes them look good in the same way that being a hero would make you look good, because Antarctica is associated with that popularly. But in fact, what this does is rope Antarctica into global scientific military management. And as you can see, they use the idea of the pristinity of Antarctica. Yes, I forgot to, you had that on your mind too, right? Ice, purity, yes. And so they use those ideas to make themselves look better, really, to clean up their images. And this is one from the DC Metro. You can see you get priority seating right there. And they're helping the environment, and they're cleaning up their image. I'll leave it there for a while. So I'm following the contemporary trends in the way that we talk about the environment and capitalism through Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine. Some of you may be familiar with her ideas, how she talks about the capitalism producing disasters so that they can normalize almost any kinds of controls and make the unbelievable or the unthinkable become normal through crisis. So I'm suggesting in some ways that environmental crisis and capital crisis are coming together in ways that we need to really think through, especially in Antarctica, though in the other pole as well. And you may be familiar with the cliche at this point of financial meltdown, and I think that kind of puns on some of the problems that we see in Antarctica and the way it's being used. So I would say that disaster capitalism, as Klein talks about it, has become almost an incitement to remilitarize through scientific regimes of surveillance and production of a new population of workers at the pole, and hope and futurity that you see these kinds of images in the ads. That these are notions so often tied to Antarctica's relatively unencumbered ice. They become aspects of the neoliberal economic and corporate military power structure. And I'm going to go beyond that reading of what Antarctica means in U.S. culture. But that is a good place to start. And in fact, that's a place that most people who study Antarctica can't even begin to talk about. I've been at conferences suggesting that, this is actually a militarized zone. And people have become apoplectically angry because they really need to see Antarctica as a heroic place, as a place where pure science is being done. It is the exceptionalism of Antarctica is deeply functioned in regimes of power, especially U.S., because the U.S. is, along with Britain and France and a couple of other, the U.S. is by far the biggest player in Antarctica. They have the biggest budget. I'm not good with numbers, but it makes all the other budgets tiny in comparison. Basically the U.S. runs Antarctica through the ATS, and that is something that people are not really able to talk about. So another way that I think about Antarctica and how I try to conceptualize it, not only through American studies as the place that Antarctica is the repression of those foundational territorial occupations, but it's also connected to what some people are calling the oceanic turn, which is a way to talk about territory of the globe, and a new way to talk about territories that aren't attached to the human, aren't populated necessarily. So this is an image by a well-known photographer, Andreas Gursky. Mm-hmm. It's called Ocean. And as you see, all he has to do is just shift the satellite view of this image to where there is no territory. And you all learned in school that the Earth is mostly water. Well, it's about time that we start talking about how these non-populated territories are being harnessed to the same kinds of power structures that run our lives, the populated world. This is an image by Ant Noble, New Zealand photographer of Antarctica, and it too takes the map and focuses it on Antarctica. I'm going to suggest there's an Antarctic turn in a similar way that there's a oceanic turn, except of course being a New Zealander and being a feminist photographer, she has a sense of humor about it. So she's taking a commoditized object and showing how Antarctica has been disregarded, disrespected. It is the bunghole of the globe. But she's saying it's time, turning it up, time to take, to focus on that, to center on this place that you actually know very little about and forget about. I call it an eccentric focus, to focus on Antarctica. And so what I also want to suggest, I have another sort of catchphrase, and that is the idea that the whole world is now becoming polar. And I really mean this concerning Antarctica. And by that I mean that now that the North Pole has become an open polar sea and has been exploitable, you probably have read about this in the news, newly exploitable shipping routes and And the South Pole has become, in some ways, revalued by being a source of climate data, right? There's more scientists now than ever down there. There's been a polarization of extremity, exception, wilderness, and those kind of empty land fantasies, and the fantasies also of resource utopia. You forgot to mention that when people think of Antarctica, they think there's got to be gold, silver, diamonds underneath there, or at least oil, right? So all these associations with polar lands have now infiltrated to other places in the world. So the whole world is actually becoming polar, and by that I mean valued, wasted, and in need of rescue. I'll give you an example. The BP oil spill in 2010 into the waters of the Gulf demonstrates the way that the Gulf of Mexico is becoming polar, because that drilling is normally associated with polar wastes, and it's now migrating. We could say that that in some ways the poles have migrated. They have migrated to various other places on the Earth to make them valued, wasted, and in need of rescue. The question at this point is, concerning Antarctica, for those who want to maintain it as a pristine place for heroic activity and feel good, and secretly a place for creating possible future wealth if you have enough money to develop it. The question is Antarctica going to become more and more like the rest of the world, which means environmentally damaged, it's messed up, overpopulated, all those things? Or is the rest of the world going to become more and more like Antarctica, meaning a place where we might actually be able to see in clear relief these types of negotiations of power? So I'm going to now show you some images from, I'm happy to say, a contemporary American photographer named Alwaleed. And she did a whole series called Events Ashore. And she went around to military bases and took photographs. And she had the prescience to understand that Antarctic bases were also part of this military project of hers. So this is a picture of McMurdo Sound in Antarctica, the McMurdo base. It's the biggest U.S. base and the biggest base in the continent. I hope that you're pretty disgusted. It's not what you expected, right? She could have taken, you can see at the over the hill there, the more traditional expanses that I won't show you traversely, because obviously I want to talk about this Antarctica. So all she did really had to do was turn around, and she's showing the fuel. These are the big fuel tanks here. And so she's actually in a tradition of earlier exploration photography where the oil drum was the thing that represented we're here. Because as you also may know, no trees, no wood, no food, no animals to eat, no nothing. Everything from a toothpick to a nuclear reactor, which there was once for a while, has to be flown into Antarctica. And so storage and this kind of suburban sprawl is basically what you see now. Interest in this photograph, and, you know, it looks like a military offload, which it is in many cases, and she makes that clear by associating it with the whole series of military-based pictures. I'm very interested in all the tracks that she clearly wants to focus on, and I write about it in a variety of ways, but I'm going to talk it through. What I'm mostly interested in is the sort of dispiriting chaos of it, and particularly the cloud that's being produced. The way that the cloud envelops these tiny humans who are they're not humanized, let's put it that way. And the cloud could be any number of things. It could be exhaust from the fuel-driven vehicles. It could be dust, ice dust, kicked up crystals. And it's probably it could be caused by wind as well. So it could be any number of things. But what it is, ultimately, is a way to remake Antarctic landscape. So we no longer have the idea of the ice as inviolable, as an outside enemy, as a thing that you can do anything to and nothing will happen. The ice here, it is menacing looking, but it also is colloidal, and it's clearly being breathed into those human figures. It's going into their lungs. The ice is interpenetrating humanity, and the humanity is part of ice. And I think that that's a way to think about climate crisis as obviously anthropogenically produced, but also then producing new notions of the human. And this, of course, is in tension with the obvious military setting of the whole thing, and of the way that these bodies are controlled and made contained by not only their vehicles, but by the horizon and the proliferation of materials. It looks, sometimes I like to describe this as, well, I've seen this part of the South Pole that she's photographed. To me, it looked like Walmart, but exploded and without a roof. But that's what it is. And the polies, the people who work at the pole, they call this the berms. And a berm is obviously a plateau to store things on, but it also, etymologically, it's related to the creation, and I like to think of these as all tiny little berms, the creation of a militarized, what do you call it, mound of earth. It could be for military purposes. It also is associated with gardening. So the idea that the South Pole has these associations now with inappropriate overlays, human overlays of militarization and of a pastoral tradition. This is the garden that's being made. It's all here in this photograph. And I think in I had about a million other things I would like to say about this, but I'm going to try to show you two more images that will, I think, help me talk about one of my chapters where I deal with feminist environmentalist art, but not in the way that you might assume when I just said that, because these feminist photographers, they're not, necessarily saving the environment in any way that that anybody else and any of these other entities do. Sorry, I've lost one of my images I wanted to show you quick, but all right, I'm gonna let it go. This is another photo by Anne Noble. It's a found object as well. She went to New Zealand base, and she found this board game by none other than British Petroleum. But it's pre-ATF. It's pre the agreement that there would be only science, no mining, no capital activity. But this is a board game that they produce because they're advertising their interest in Antarctica, their desire for an empire there. And what she's done is rephotograph it. And that's a form of art making that she puts the camera down and makes certain decisions. So what I say is that the photograph centers itself dead on the center of the original board game, which consists of a cardboard playing surface featuring a highly schematic white and light blue map of Antarctica centered on the South Pole. That reminds me of that map I showed you. And the bright red dots are fuel depots, and the game, you play it by rolling dice, and you get cards that say things like, crash causes fuel loss, wait 3 throws for more BP. And so the game is all about disaster and rescue on this projected ice skate. And I suggest that the photograph's tight framing of the board has the effect of squeezing out the horizon so that the conventionally powerful view from above of the map, usually that's a way to really control the territory, is actually more claustrophobic than anything else. You don't really feel in control when you look at this image. And also, she's, by rephotographing the game board, she's suggesting, on the one hand, she's releasing the British of their responsibility for, this kind of drilling. After all, it's just a game. But on the other hand, she also releases the potential of national and corporate development, deployment of heroic associations to once again control and overlay the ice. So there's all these layers on the ice. I also am very interested in rephotography because what it does in its pressuring of the time distinction of the original to the copy, the following in the footstep kind of motif that I'm very interested in, this takes on a greater meaning in a landscape in which the question of origination and historical claim, who got there first, that's back to the Scott Amundsen race to the pole, that has created the map, if not the territory. So Noble's rephotography becomes a mechanism for elaborating and superimposing, extending and reversing time and space. It's very powerful. She adds a non-human layer of intervention, and that is the meeting of the photographic surfaces. The camera lens faces the mechanically drawn game board, and it evacuates human from there to produce the possibility of a non-human generated field. And that's the field that I'm interested in, that I think a lot of these recent feminist photographers are creating. They're creating the non-human elaboration of human-centeredness. And it begs the question, is it natural or is it anthropogenic, man-made? And that's exactly the question that's at the center of climate change controversy and the data that in some ways, some of these photographers are actually creating data as they go down there and document and create these occasions, these interfaces. And I'm very interested in how these photographers are intervening in some of the more merely documentary or politicized ways of talking about what's happening to the ice. As we all know, it is melting. We forgot to mention that at the beginning. Melting, we're all going to die. So that's what these photographers are trying to get us, these artists are trying to get us to think about. What's also happening here is that in some ways, this rephotography of BP before the treaty, it makes us understand that what happened in the Gulf, the oil spill there, is a copy, another rephotography in some ways, of this original BP moment of this map. So that's another way that the whole world is becoming polar by following in the footsteps or being copies of this moment. It reanimates an imperial past, and as it turns out, it has also been predictive of a future. This very interesting photograph. So that's where we are. In the interest of time, I do have some other images. I'll go to the last one. Oh yeah. Oh, all right. This is an image of an Antarctic seascape that is made digitally, purely digitally, by an artist who's never been there. So there's no body involved. The interface is, I guess you can call it imaginative. There is no original. And so I think this is an interesting and problematic way to, I like to say, perversely encounter the materiality of ice that cannot be represented, cannot be reached by your average person. And remember, an infinitesimal number of people are actually ever on the ice to represent it in any way. And most of them can't be trusted. None of them can be, actually. And so what this artist, Marina Zurkow, has done is create an animation of an imaginary landscape that kind of goes back to Poe in some ways, making up what the South Pole is like. But in this one, there is various promises, various hopes about, not simple ones about recuperation, but of the actual territory, of the ice itself. But I think that in the way that Zurkow is creating a virtual landscape, it indexes all the problems, all the history. This is sort of like a Leonardo da Vinci animation that goes on inside of it. She calls the bottle, it's kind of a close-up, so it's hard to see. It's a bottle that spins in the ocean like a piece of flotsam, but it is associated with maps, with popular culture, and with she calls the piece elixir, and she discusses it as this bottle as a piece of magical thinking, and so it's associated with all sorts of techno-scientific fixes and snake oil, basically. But I think that she offers a way to think about ice as being just ice and not encumbered by all these contained overlays and histories. And that's a project that I think is one that might counter the ongoing and unavoidable militarization and of the poles. That is a problem that no one really wants to talk about and people are not aware of. And feminist artists don't, simply counter that history. They're also complicit in the same way that, I'm complicit as well. I mean, I was there, and I used up all my fuel to go there, and I was supported on the ice. And in order to rescue ourselves, I think our complicity and our relation to climate crisis has to be and needs to be more not avoided, but actually moved through. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
We have time for questions.
Yeah.
Yep. Could you tell us something about the time zones, if it's within the realm of your...
Yeah, well, there is, I forgot to mention that as well, there's no time in Antarctica. It's actually, I'm glad you mentioned time. Antarctica, one of the cliches about it is that it's frozen in time, right? And you can go to Antarctica and you go back, well, usually as far as the heroic era. People want to be real men again, people want to have a pure and unencumbered relation to territory. They don't want to think that they killed natives or they took over somebody else's land in order to be heroic. So that's one of the things that it does. So I know I'm not answering your question, but I'm really glad that you asked it. It's sometimes very difficult to talk about Antarctica because there are so many assumptions that actually are never spoken because we have no relation to this place except these fantasy relations. So yes, Antarctica is the place that's frozen in time. And what I like to say about that, it then allows Antarctica to be endlessly exploited as an open possibility for capital, even though we think of it as a place from deep history, sometimes from obviously pre-human history, right? Because Antarctica's been there long before humans have been on the Earth. But the time of this was made in 2010, this particular image. And all the photographs, except the first one that I showed you, are all made in the last 4 years. Yes?
I think that your literary background actually provides a really interesting insight to examining the Antarctic. And I'm wondering if you can discuss a little bit more the image of the hero or the masculine conqueror as the ideal image that occurs many times in literature, in popular culture, in military and scientific projects like Antarctica, NASA, the ocean, and how the environment is often referred to on feminine terms, Mother Nature, the sea is female, and that you pointed out that Lockheed Martin has used this image as a way of bolstering its own image. So it's kind of this reflection of society's value of this hero image as being the ideal.
Yeah, of course, Antarctica is territory, and it's empty territory, so it could be recuperated as that possibility for virgin land. Let's put it that way. And certainly it's been written about that a lot. It's a reflex. I mean, people can hardly help themselves. But the thing about Antarctica is that it kills you. So, and that was always a problem from the very start. For these, could you imagine the disappointment? These guys, they want to be heroes. And they want to explore. They want to find the last, whatever territory there is. And for my literary history, the pre-20th century literature is all about finding lost races, diamonds, jewels, all the things that you couldn't get in the civilized world. The lost race fantasies are particularly interesting. And people would, find stuff that they really needed in Antarctica, and it would always be warm. They would always have these pseudoscientific ways of explaining how once you get over the ice barrier, it actually gets warmer. And so Poe was very into that. And Poe, in fact, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym continues to produce copies and people who want to finish his unfinished voyage, because he gets, I don't know, has anyone read that? Mm-hmm. Well, naturally. But it's considered, it's gotten actually more attention over the years, but at first it was considered just kind of the crispy critter of Poe's ode. No one really wanted to read it. And it ends with a vision of, at the lip of at the hole of the South Pole. And I won't go into detail about it, but it seems unfinished. It was not, but it spawned many reiterations of the desire to find good stuff there, including lost races with really sexy women in them too. Mm-hmm. It goes on and on. They're actually pretty interesting, but I decided not to go that route because I felt that I would be, in some ways, going in that direction. I would become the explorer. There was a piece of me that has always been suspicious about this project because I am trained in a U.S. academy where identity politics, race, and women's studies, and all the identity studies were just exploding. And I was a white woman who didn't want to do my so-called identity, which seemed a little overdetermined and obvious. And so I just couldn't go there. And I went to Antarctica instead. And that was I think a fantasy of mine, that I could escape my area by going to Antarctica, and a fantasy that I think imitated some of, Poe's most notorious characterless hero, Pym, the one who goes from New Bedford to the South Pole in a sort of wayward journey, is not considered a very strong character. Yeah.
Just to point out, how did you get an NSF grant? I mean, what did you tell the NSF you were there to do?
Yeah, that's the thing. I did mostly tell them I was there, and I was planning to try to write this literary account of it. And it's not like other people haven't written about the literature of Antarctica, but they really, this is I forgot to mention, it's a very European-focused field. People who do American relations to the U.S., to Antarctica, very, very little written. And most of it is pretty much jingoistic. So there was, they were interested in my approaches, and I was planning a book like that. It just didn't get written.
But again, what are you reading into why they would do it? Why would a science foundation be interested in a humanist going to Antarctica?
Oh, well, actually, this was a part of my talk that I didn't get to give because I always elaborate, and I cannot read what I write. I always talk it. But the part of the ways that these science management programs work is to have a little program, and there's this called the Antarctic Artists and Writers Program, that the people who actually work in Antarctica, they call those people the woos. And it sounds like it does. So they throw a little money at artists and writers. Yeah. So I was one of those, and you're basically excess baggage. It takes a lot of money, and I was told it cost $30,000 to bring me there for 6 weeks, and I was made to feel fairly beholden and absolutely useless. Every day they reminded you that you're useless. But yeah.
Yeah, we all know that America was discovered in 1497 by Amerigo. When and by whom was Antarctica discovered? Discovered between coasts.
Well, there's it's not like there's too much controversy about the facts of the case. People, this is a place for positivist history, like you wouldn't believe. They literally follow the tracks, and that's why I love these artists who also follow the tracks and are interested in footprints, but do completely virtual and non-positivist, meaning not fact-based things with the problem of the visual there. So in 1912, that guy who fell off the pedestal, he and a team of 4 others, they actually walked pretty much to the South Pole. At the same time, the Norwegian team, led by Roald Amundsen, took dogs and a lot more skill, apparently, though I think it's arguable, and beat them to the pole. So Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian, was the first to the South Pole. Now, who actually discovered Antarctica? Some European, probably, or some Maori warrior who got in a little boat, and they have myths about lands to the south. I put my money on the Maori, actually, in terms of time. Yeah.
Two very good questions. Actually, perfect transition by mentioning the Maoris. I'm wondering if you encountered any narratives from the Maoris or from any of the pre-European, Brazilian, Argentinian. I mean, those are geographically close, and one could assume that they've encountered Antarctica in one form or the other. Whether such narratives do exist, and the second question, and I'll get them out and then shut up. The more you talk, the more I saw the discourse about the International Space Station, the space travel as some kind of a counterpoint to this. Do you see any resonance with this? Because it's been in the news quite a lot. If you don't focus on page 1, it's they've been talking about all the crazy billionaires who are booking tickets to go to Mars in
Yes.
2039.
All right. Well, basically, if it wasn't for you, thank you, I would go back to the U.S. in a few days and kick myself for not getting to these things, because they actually were part of the paper that I was going to, that I couldn't totally give. So I'll take the first question first, which is about, well, basically what I call, because of Ursula Le Guin, who is an American science fiction writer, fantasy writer, a short story she wrote in '81. So she was very prescient. It's called Sur, and that means south. And she refers to, in it, Antarctica as South America. She has her narrator call Antarctica South America. So what she does in this short story, which is a perfect story, and every word of it is amazing, so I'm quite inspired by it. What she does is retroactively insert a Latin American women's expedition to this very pole I was telling you about, where these guys are duking it out, the Europeans are duking it out, turn of the century, so 1911. And her women get there first, and she writes their narrative. It's a hoax narrative, obviously, but it's written in that way, sort of in the way that Poe wrote Pym, as a hoax narrative. And they have a pretty easy time of it, and it's no big deal. They go and they leave, and the last line of the story is, "We left no footprints." We left no footprints, even. That's the last word. And so there's a casualness to it too, which is of course a great job of one-upmanship, right? The women just turned out to be better and better suited for the hardships of the ice than the tragic heroes of history. But she's also making a point about geopolitics and how Latin America is closer in some ways, and that is one of the forces in geopolitics is the nations on the southern hemisphere, and why does Europe and now the U.S. Run the show? And so that kind of resistance and commentary, and as well as some of the other ways that Le Guin talks about the ice, her women, they're like feminist environmentalists, and this again is so ahead of the curve of how people think about Antarctica now and their concerns. They refer to the ice as living ice. And so that's how I got interested finally in realizing that there's a material aspect to ice that cannot be rendered and justified through exploration, representation, even governmental representation, because there's no population there except for workers at this point who actually aren't even accorded all the rights. The U.S. workers especially are not accorded all the rights of citizens when they work on the ice there, because they are so severely managed and controlled in what has become, you saw the pictures, basically an office park on ice. But so this whole alternative history associated with post-colonial feminism, and but also, as I elaborated from Le Guin, associated with a materialist understanding of ice itself, not associated through humans, through even the representation that these artists are putting out. As I tried to make clear that they find a way to create this space of the virtual, where the actual materiality of the living ice has its place, separate from human overlay intervention. So that's the one thing. And then the other was about the Antarctica space analog, which is an enormous part of the ways that Antarctica has been understood as the part of the Earth that is most like the moon or the rest of the universe. And so that question about is Antarctica going to become more like the rest of the world, or is the rest of the world going to become an analog for wasted space and a world that is no longer livable except in extreme techno-scientific terms. And I don't know what's going to happen with that. I mean, people want to colonize Antarctica. They're trying to figure out ways to live there. It's actually used as a testing ground for Mars programs and things like that. It's like going to the moon but cheaper. And the only thing you have that the moon doesn't have is, it has gravity and it has air. Those are big, but otherwise it is an analog. And like all analogs, basically metaphors. That's where I get very interested and concerned, because there's no real equality there. They're irrational. And that's what I mean by this kind of, I'm interested in the overlays of the sector mapping and of claims, geopolitical claims, and also of technologies of vision. These overlays are always irrational, and they create, though, in their incommensurabilities, they create these virtual possibilities that are then linked to the ice itself. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you see, or if you can trace a shift in the sort of operation of Antarctica as cultural fantasy from the period when people begin to explore it. Because as you're talking, it seems like there's a kind of 19th century convention of representation where Antarctica stands in as Edenic plenitude, or the possibility of plenitude or fantasy, and then later in a 20th century sense, that almost a fantasy of negation that comes into play, sort of emptiness and the end of everything, and the sublime. So is that
Well, I'm
fair?
smiling because you guys are good. I think you're getting it better than I am. You're like reminding me. I have an enormous amount of the book is about the only U.S. major explorer. His name is Byrd. Anyone heard of him? He was big in the 20s and 30s, and he died by the end of the 50s, a broken man, because he wanted to claim Antarctica for the U.S., and he couldn't get a succession of governments to do it because governments know better. The U.S. has a lot of control over Antarctica without sovereignty, without territory. And that's, of course, what I'm interested in terms of the contemporary, what I call the neoliberal scientific management regimes that actually get to control Antarctica in a way that traditional claims could never. So Byrd got caught up. He was a 19th century man. He put his body on the ice. He also was an airplane guy, so he was technoscience, new technoscience. But then that wasn't enough. That wasn't good enough. I mean, he flew over various parts. He flew over the pole, first to fly over the pole. But then nothing happened. They didn't claim it. They didn't name it after him. Well, they named parts of it after him. You can get your name in Antarctica. You could get your name. If you give enough money to the right person, you can get things named after you. But he couldn't get the land. And so he tried various stunts. He overwintered by himself for no reason in a cabin further south in 36, and he almost died. He wrote, or it was ghostwritten, a memoir in 38 that was a bestseller. So he was like a Boy Scout. He was like going back to the heroic past. But that time was shifting. He couldn't get the claim, and then he sort of became involved in the Antarctic treaty system as a way to, try to get that old-fashioned feeling going. But no, he became sort of a transition point into the new regime. Yeah.